Welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia for another episode in our Criminals, Cutthroats and Convicts series. We have finally come to the episode for Stan the Man Smith, part of the A-Team. He was known as the Enforcer. Stan the Man Smith, born Stanley John Smith on the 3rd of January 1937, was a Balmain boy, much like Lennie McPherson, who was 16 years his senior. And Stan most probably grew up idolising, or at least hearing about Lennie's stories and his rise to power. Stan's childhood home of 3 Curtis Road, Balmain, went on the market after 45 years in 2022, being sold for $4.3 million. The 434 metre squared residence still had Stan's father's name, Ray, carved into a wooden window frame in the bathroom of the home, long after his family had lived there. I find that fascinating. The home was built in around 1904 and was originally used as a girls' finishing school before the Smith family lived there. From there, it passed hands to a neurosurgeon, then on to a couple who had the property for 45 years. And just 2 years ago, it was sold on again. Now very much renovated, it still has the charm of a home now 120 years old. By the time Stan was old enough to understand what life could be like as a criminal, Lennie was making friends in all the right places. Like Lennie, as well as George, Stan was a troubled teen and ended up in both Gosford and Tamworth boys' homes, where boys were abused and also taught the hardened life early. Following very much in Lennie's footsteps, by 17 he had a position at the docks. Having known Geroge Freeman in the boys' homes, George being 2 years older, he was introduced to Lennie McPherson. Being a Balmain boy would have gone a long way to uniting these two. Back in a time when suburbs and territories were an alliance and a brotherhood, they would look after each other and often had gangs from the area. Lennie took Stan under his wing, which would soon lead to a very prosperous and lifelong friendship. Stan the Man Smith would also be known as the Enforcer. When Stan was 18, he married a local girl by the name of Marilyn Moss. Another important lifelong relationship would be entered into. Despite what women he may have had between the sheets, he remained married to Marilyn his whole life. Stan learned very quickly, using brutality got him the desired result. Whether it was collecting monies owed to Lennie and the A-Team, or if he had to make a prostitute understand what was required, he used violence to make this happen, and became rather well known for this, making him one of the most feared and toughest criminals of his era. They said at the time that getting advice from Stan the Man Smith would often ensure payment was made pretty quickly. If Stan came after you, you knew if you didn't cough up what was owed, you were going to pay the price heavily. It was also believed that Lennie McPherson had to pay cost of damages to prostitutes that Stan didn't get his way with. One woman was even said to have stated that if you didn't comply with what Stan Smith wanted from you, you would often end up regretting it, having ankles strapped together or leashed, or being held outside a top floor window. The woman who had danced at the Latin Quarter remembers Stan Smith enjoying being so brutal, traits that he probably gained having been at the Gosford and Tamworth boys' homes, where the brutality was senseless and relentless. If you weren't tough enough to handle it, it would break you. Oftentimes, you had to be the one doing the breaking if you wanted to be on top. And Stan the Man Smith at this time seems very much on top of his game, to the demise of those who came up against him, including Robert Prettyboy Walker, who, it seems, stood up to Stan. Robert Prettyboy Walker was also a standover, an enforcer of sorts, who liked to brag at how big he was and how tough he was. Well, Stan didn't like that, and with the force of the A-team behind him, was going to put a stop to Prettyboy. As we mentioned in Lennie McPherson's Mr. Big episodes, he remarried in 1963. It was his wedding to Marlene, where they stepped out to do away with Prettyboy. But it all happened after an earlier altercation. Now, Robert Prettyboy Walker didn't like the way that Stan the Man Smith was handling the prostitutes. He didn't like the violence, I guess, or that he didn't respect the women. Prettyboy and some mates get a jump on Stan and beat him up, whether to scare him off so he could take his standover business or to show him who was boss. Well, Stan regroups and decides to pay a visit to Prettyboy's house with a few of his mates to even the score. But Robert Walker fires on Stan as he enters the house and hits him in the chest. His mates race him out of there into the hospital, where he is tight-lipped about what happened to police. But the score is well and truly settled, as we know, on Lennie's wedding night. Once Stan recovered from being shot several times by Robert Prettyboy Walker, revealing nothing to the cops, as mentioned, and it is alleged, Lennie and Stan excused themselves from Lennie's own wedding to pay Robert Prettyboy Walker a visit and give him a ticket, a one-way ticket, straight to hell, emptying a machine gun into his body, then returning back to the wedding with a stone-clad alibi. At one time, it was believed Stan was the underworld's top assassin, linked to at least 25 shootings and blamed for almost every gangland hit that took place. Establishing himself in the late 1950s to early 1960s, by the mid-1960s he was the hitman of the A-team. Dressed smartly, one could almost dismiss him at first glance as a businessman. Well, he was of sorts. He learned pretty good from Lennie that there was more money to be made than just standing over. Eliminating your competitors, such as with Prettyboy Walker. Now, as the story went, Robert Prettyboy Walker kind of asked for it. Getting involved with the A-team was a death sentence if you weren't on their side, by their terms. Those who came up against them, or tried to go around them, ended up dead. They were very much feared, all three of them, and this is why they were at the top for so long. It is believed both Stan the Man Smith and George Freeman were part of the Kangaroo Gang in the mid to late 60s. George Freeman is actually jailed, as mentioned in his video, in Fremantle for stealing. But Stan the Man Smith didn't get caught, and he meets up with fellow Kangaroo Gang member Lawrence McLean. They would later do business together. For the remainder of the 60s, Stan is close to Lennie, meeting and greeting with Chicago Syndicate member Joe Testa. In the US with Geroge Freeman, it is said that at one of these parties on their trip, one of Joe Tester's rivals shows up and starts trouble, laying into Joe, hitting him. Well, Stan springs into action, launching himself onto the rival and biting his nose off, spitting it out onto the floor in front of everyone. Well, Tester was said to have been blown away by Stan's loyalty, when the altercation had had nothing to do with Stan, but he leapt to Tester's defence all the same. Tester was quite impressed at the loyalty, and despite the Mafia or Chicago Syndicate not really ending up doing business in a big way with the Aussies, it was something Tester was unlikely to forget, and they had a good friendship until Tester's death, car bombing in 1981. Now Stan, as a family man, has 3 kids with Marilyn. 3 boys, much like Lennie and George. There is no mention of the children coming together or being friendly, possibly as they were at different ages, and perhaps they did see each other, but it has been kept out of the spotlight. And like most criminals at the time, associating in public together could get you a fine. It was best to avoid the media attention. The A-team seemed like it was solid. They would all follow each other into fire, taking a bullet for each other and killing for each other, side by side. But there was one thing that distanced them: drugs. Lennie and Stan were barred from entering Hong Kong in 1966, trying to smuggle gold and narcotics. Lennie was further involved in drugs when he was connected to Bernie Horton in 1967. He was the US businessman with links to CIA. George was also slightly involved with the drug trade through Dr. Nick Pautos, who was trafficking, but George kept his distance from these particular dealings and didn't start taking drugs himself until he was shot in the face and then addicted to the pethidine. But that wasn't until 1979. In the early 1970s, Stan was fined for trying to sell amphetamines, but it didn't slow Stan down. He got involved with international drug trafficker Lawrence McLean, aka Joe Cool, Stan's mate from the Kangaroo Gang, and by the mid-1970s they were heavily into the production and trade of cannabis. At this time, the A-team were doing their own thing, but still could be called on if needed. It is alleged that they came together in 1972 to take out Kevin Victor Gore, who had allegedly shot their mate Arthur Delaney in the spine. Arthur was the leader of the Kangaroo Gang, and Kevin Victor Gore was the leader of the Toe Cutters. Now, Arthur Delaney survived, but it took him years to walk again, and it is believed that Geroge Freeman at least, and Stan Smith perhaps, murdered Kevin Victor Gore. But then it is alleged Stuart John Reagan, the magician, may have taken him out after a robbery had been divvied up amongst people. They were all trying to collect on this big amount. There was a couple of people that went missing because of this robbery, including a Robert Donnelly, who Nettie Smith grew up with, and says he wasn't a bad guy at all. But he'd borrowed Gore's car a couple of days earlier and went missing after that. The car was found burnt out in Earlwood. Perhaps he'd been murdered, mistaken for Gore. Robert Donnelly's brother Viv believed that everyone who went missing, presumed dead, from this particular robbery ended up under the second runway at Sydney Airport. Challenges occurred for Stan when his oldest son, Stan Jr., became addicted to heroin. This put some strain on the family. By 1977, the Woodward Royal Commission began, and Stan was questioned over his involvement in the drug trade, to which he denied, stating his family were dealing with drug addiction, referring to Stan Jr., and that he had nothing to do with drugs for this reason. The judge not believing this and stating his company, Balmain Welding, was a front for illegal drug business. In 1977, Stan the Man Smith is arrested for possession of hemp at Melbourne Airport. George Freeman pays the bail at $20,000. Stan and Lawrence use Frank Webb to make deliveries and drops for them, and he has said that he always looked his best just in case the police pulled him over and he looked like a regular guy working, someone who didn't look like a drug runner. Working out of the Byron Bay hinterland as well as up north into Queensland, they were doing a good business, importing Thai sticks, and some believed that they were connected to Howard Mr. Nice Marks, a Welsh drug smuggler, and Philip Sparrowhawk, a British drug smuggler. They had had apparent connections to M16 and the CIA. There was 5 tons of marijuana bound for Australia, going from Thailand through Amsterdam. The plan was that they would have it sent through Uncle Joe, an Aussie guy in his 50s, who would organise it to be imported through to Australia. But something goes wrong in Thailand and all are arrested, including Philip Sparrowhawk, who writes this in his book Grass. When he's arrested in Thailand, he spends time in 2 notorious Thailand jails, as well as served many years in America as well after being extradited. It's a tough world in the drug trafficking business. Some don't survive it. Luckily, these arrests didn't reach Stan and his group. However, in 1979, Stan had other devastating news. He loses his son, Stan Jr., to a heroin overdose. Join us in part 2, where we continue Stan's journey, which has quite an interesting turn. If you're enjoying these 18 videos, definitely give them a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to hit that notification bell so you're aware when we're posting part 2 of Stan the Man Smith, or Stan the Enforcer, and the A-Team.